"Master Stoppy here," he repeated. It was lucky I had not brought my automatic pistol. Bad I had it with me. I should certainly have shot him then and there. "Let go, you dog," I shouted. He stared at me, panic-stricken, but would not obey. In a fury, and feeling sure that further delay would enable her to escape me, I gave him a knockout blow on the chin, which crumbled him up in the road. Now the cycle was free, but when I tried to mount, I found that the front wheel had been buckled in the fall and would not turn. After a vain attempt to straighten the wheel, I flung the machine in the dust beside the China boy, who, bleeding from my violence, was coming to his senses, and ran along the road into the settlement. Yes, I ran, and here again, you, who have not lived in the tropics, will find it hard to realize all that this implies. For a white man, a European, thus to forget his dignity and to run before a lot of staring natives is to make himself a laughingstock. Well, I was past thinking of my dignity. I ran like a madman in front of the huts where the inmates gaped to see the settlement doctor, the White Lord, running like a rickshaw coolie. I was dripping with sweat when I reached the settlement. "Where's the car?" I shouted, breathless. "Just gone, Toon," came the answer. They were staring at me in astonishment. I must have looked like a lunatic, wet and dirty, as I shouted out my question the moment I was within hail. Glancing down the road, I saw no longer the car, but the dust raised by its passing. She had made good her escape. Her device of leaving the boy to hinder me had been successful. Yet, after all, her flight availed her nothing. In the tropics, the names and the doings of the scattered members of the ruling European caste are known to all. From this outlook, Java is but a big village where gossip is rife. While she had been visiting me, her chauffeur had spent an idle hour in the settlement headquarters. Within a few minutes, I knew everything, knew her name, and that she lived in the provincial capital more than 150 miles away. She was, as, indeed, I knew already, an Englishwoman. Her husband was a Dutch merchant fabulously rich. He had been away 5 months on a business journey in America and was expected back in a few days. Then, husband and wife were to pay a visit to England. Her husband had been 5 months away. It had been obvious to me that she could not be more than 3 months pregnant. Till now it has been easy enough for me to explain everything to you clearly, for up to this point my motives were plain to myself. As a doctor, a trained observer, I could readily diagnose my own condition, but from now on I was like a man in delirium. I had completely lost self-control. I knew how preposterous were my actions, and yet I went on doing them. Have you ever heard of running amok? Yes, I think so. It's some sort of drunken frenzy among the Malays, isn't it? More than drunkenness, more than frenzy. It's a condition which makes a man behave like a rabid dog, transforms him into a homicidal maniac. It's a strange and terrible mental disorder. I've seen cases of it and studied them carefully while in the East, without ever being able to clear up its true nature. It's partly an outcome of the climate, of the sultry, damp, oppressive atmosphere, which strains the nerves until at last they snap. Of course, a Malay who runs amok has generally been in trouble of some sort, jealousy, gambling losses, or whatnot. The man will be sitting quietly, as if there were nothing wrong, just as I was sitting in my room before she came to see me. Suddenly he will spring to his feet, seize his kriss, dash into the street, and run headlong, no matter where. He stabs any who happen to find themselves in his path, and the shedding of blood infuriates him more and more. He foams at the mouth, shouts as he runs, tears on and on, brandishing his blood-stained dagger. Everyone knows that nothing but death will stop the madman. They scurry out of his way, shouting amok, amok, to warn others. Thus he runs, killing, 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 until he is shot down like the mad dog that he is. It is because I have seen Malays running amok that I know so well what was my condition during those days still so recent, those days about which I am going to tell you. Like such a Malay, I ran my furious course in pursuit of that Englishwoman, looking neither to the right nor to the left. obsessed with the one thought of seeing her again. I can scarcely remember all I did in the hurried moments before I actually set out on her trail. Within a minute or two of learning her name and where she lived, I had borrowed a bicycle and was racing back to my own quarters. I flung a spare suit or two into a valise, stuffed a bundle of notes into my pocket, and rode off to the nearest railway station. I did not report to the district officer. I made no arrangements about a substitute. I left the house just as it was, paying no heed to the servants who gathered round me asking for instructions. Within an hour from the time when that woman had first called to see me, I had broken with the past and was running amok into the void. In truth, I gained nothing by my haste, as I should have known had I been able to think. It was late afternoon when I got to the railway station, and in the Javanese mountains the trains do not run after dark for fear of washouts. After a sleepless night in the dak bungalow and a day's journey by rail, at 6 in the evening I reached the town where she lived, feeling sure that, by car, she would have got there long before me. Within 10 minutes I was at her door. What could have been more senseless? You will say, I know, but one who is running amok runs amok. He does not look where he is going. I sent in my card. The servant, not the China boy, I suppose he had not turned up yet, came back to say that his mistress was not well enough to see anyone. I stumbled into the street. For an hour or more I hung around the house in the forlorn hope that perhaps she would relent and would send out for me. Then I took a room at a neighboring hotel and had a couple of bottles of whiskey sent upstairs. With these and a stiff dose of veronal I at length managed to drug myself into unconsciousness, a heavy sleep that was the only interlude in the race from life to death. 8 bells struck. It was 4 in the morning. The sudden noise startled the narrator, and he broke off abruptly. In a little while, however, collecting himself, he went on with his story. It is hard to describe the hours that followed. I think I must have had fever. Anyhow, I was in a state of irritability bordering on madness. I was running amok. It was on Tuesday evening that I got to the coast town, and as I learned next morning, her husband was expected on Saturday. There were 3 clear days during which I might help her out of her trouble. I knew there wasn't a moment to waste, and she wouldn't see me. My longing to help, and my longing, still greater, if possible, to excuse myself or my insane demand, intensified the disorder of my nerves. Every second was precious. The whole thing hung by a hair, and I had behaved so outrageously that she would not let me come near her. Imagine that you are running after someone to warn him against an assassin, and that he takes you for the would-be assassin, so that he flees from you towards destruction. All that she could see in me was the frenzied pursuer who had humiliated her with the base proposal and now wanted to renew it. That was the absurdity of the whole thing. My one wish was to help her, and she would not see me. I would have committed any crime to help her, but she did not know. Next morning when I called, the China boy was standing at the door. I supposed that he had got back by the same train as myself. He must have been on the lookout. For the instant I appeared, he whisked out of sight, though not before I had seen the bruises on his face. Perhaps he had only hurried in to announce my coming. That is one of the things that madden me now, to think that she may have realized that, after all, I wanted to help, and may have been ready to receive me. But the sight of him reminded me of my shame, so that I turned back from the door without venturing to send in my name. I went away in torment when she, perhaps, in no less torment, was awaiting me. I did not know how to pass the weary hours in this unfamiliar town. At length it occurred to me to call on the vice-resident, the man whose leg I had set to rides up country after he had had a motor smash. He was at home, and was, of course, delighted to see me. Did I tell you that I can speak Dutch as fluently as any Dutchman? I was at school in Holland for a couple of years. That was one reason why I chose the Dutch colonial service when I had to clear out of Leipzig. There must have been something queer about my manner, though. My grateful patient, for all his civility, eyed me askance, as if he divined that I was running amok. I told him I had come to ask for a transfer. I couldn't live in the wilds any longer. I wanted an instant remove to the provincial capital. He looked at me questioningly and in a non-committal way, much as a medical man looks at a patient. A nervous breakdown, doctor, he inquired. I understand that only too well. We can arrange matters for you, but you'll have to wait for a little while. 3 or 4 weeks, let us say, while we're finding someone to relieve you at your present post. 3 or 4 weeks, I exclaimed. I can't wait a single day. Again that questioning look. I'm afraid you'll have to put up with it, doctor. We mustn't leave your station unattended. Still, I promise you I'll set matters in train this very day. I stood there biting my lips and realizing for the first time how completely I had sold myself into slavery. It was in my mind to defy him and his regulations, but he was tactful, he was indebted to me, and he did not want an open breach. Forestalling my determination to reply angrily, he went on, I have been living like a hermit, you know, and that's enough to put anyone's nerves on edge. We've all been wondering why you never asked for leave, why you never came to see us down here. Some cheerful company, now and then, would have done you all the good in the world. This evening, by the way, there's a reception at Government House. Won't you join us? The whole colony will be there, including a good many people who have often asked about you and have wanted very much to make your acquaintance. At this I pricked up my ears. Asked about me, wanted to make my acquaintance. Was she one of them? The thought was like wine to me. I remembered my manners, thanked him for his invitation and promised to come early. I did go early, too early. Spurred on by impatience, I was the first to appear in the great drawing room at the residency. There I had to sit cooling my heels and listening to the soft tread of the barefooted native servants who went to and fro about their business and, so it seemed to my morbid imagination, was sniggering at me behind my back. For a quarter of an hour I was the only guest amid a silence which, when the servants had finished their preparations, became so profound that I could hear the ticking of my watch in my pocket. Then the other guests began to arrive, some government officials with their wives, and the vice-president put in an appearance. He welcomed me most graciously and entered into a long conversation in which, I think, I was able to keep my end up all right until, of a sudden, my nervousness returned and I began to falter. She had entered the room, and it was a good thing that at this moment the vice-president wound up his talk with me and began a conversation with someone else, for otherwise I believe I should simply have turned my back on the man. She was dressed in yellow silk, which set off her ivory shoulders admirably, and was talking brightly amid a group. Yet I, who knew her secret trouble, could read, or fancied I could read, care beneath her smile. I moved nearer, but she did not or would not see me. That smile of hers maddened me once more, for I knew it to be feigned. Today is Wednesday, I thought. In Saturday her husband will be back. How can she smile so unconcernedly? How can she toy with her fan, instead of breaking it with a convulsive clutch? I, a stranger, was trembling in face of what awaited her. I, a stranger, had for days been suffering with her suffering. What could her smile be but a mask to hide the storm that raged within? From the next room came the sound of music. Dancing was to begin. A middle-aged officer claimed her as his partner. Excusing herself to those with whom she had been conversing, she took his arm and walked with him towards the ballroom. This brought her close to me and she could not fail to see me. For a moment she was startled, and then, before I could make up my mind whether or not to claim acquaintance, she nodded in a friendly way, said good evening, doctor, and passed on. No one could have guessed what lay hidden behind that casual glance. Indeed, I myself was puzzled. Why had she openly recognized me? Was she making an advance, an offer of reconciliation? Was she still on the defensive? Had she merely been taken by surprise? How could I tell? All I knew was that I had been stirred to the depths. I watched her as she waltzed, a smile of enjoyment playing about her lips, and I knew that all the while she must be thinking, not of the dance, but of the one thing of which I was thinking, of the dread secret which she and I alone shared. The thought intensified, if possible, my anxiety, my longing, and my bewilderment. I don't know if anyone else was observing me, but I am sure that my eager scrutiny of her must have been in manifest contrast to her ostensible unconcern. I simply could not look at anyone but her, for I was watching all the time to see whether she would not, were it but for a moment, let the mask fall. The fixity of my stare must have been disagreeable to her. As she came back on her partner's arm, she flashed a look at me, dictatorial, angry, as if bidding me to exercise a little more self-control. But I, as I have explained to you, was running amok. I knew well enough what her glance meant. Don't attract attention to me like this. Keep yourself in hand. She was asking me to show some discretion in this place of public assembly. I felt assured now that if I went quietly home she would receive me should I call on the morrow, that all she wanted of me was that I should behave decorously, that she was, with good reason, afraid of my making a scene. Yes, I understood what she wanted, but I was running amok and I had to speak to her there and then. I moved over to the group amid which she was talking. They were all strangers to me, yet I rudely shouldered my way in among them. There I stood my ground listening to her, though I trembled like a whipped cur whenever her eyes rested coldly on mine. I was obviously unwelcome. No one said a word to me, and it must have been plain that she resented my intrusion. I cannot tell how long I should have gone on standing there. To all eternity, perhaps. I was spellbound. To her, however, the strain became unbearable. Suddenly she broke off and, with a charming and convincing assumption of indifference, said, "Well, I'm rather tired, so I shall turn in early. I'll ask you to excuse me. Good night." She gave a friendly nod which included me with the others, and turned away. I watched her smooth, white, well-shaped back above her yellow silk gown, and at first, so dazed was I scarcely realized that I was to see her no more that evening, that I was to have no word with her on that last evening to which I had looked forward as the evening of salvation. I stood stock still until I grasped this. Then, I must put the whole picture before you if I am to make you understand what an idiot I made of myself. The big drawing room at the Residency was now almost empty, though blazing with light. Most of the guests were dancing in the ballroom, while the older man who had lost taste for pairing off in this way had settled down to cards elsewhere. There were but a few scattered groups talking here and there. Across this huge hall she walked, with that dignity and grace which enthralled me, nodding farewell to one and to another as she passed. By the time I had fully taken in the situation, she was at the other end of the room and about to leave it. At that instant, becoming aware that she would escape me, I started to run after her. Yes, to run, my pumps clattering as I sped across the polished floor. Of course, everyone stared at me, and I was overwhelmed with shame. Yet I could not stop. I caught her up as she reached the door, and she turned on me, her eyes blazing, her nostrils quivering with scorn. But she had the self-command which in me was so lamentably lacking, and in an instant she had mastered her anger and burst out laughing. With ready wit, speaking loudly so that all could hear, she said, "Oh, doctor, so you've just remembered that prescription for my little boy. After all, you man of science are apt to be forgetful now and again, aren't you?" A man standing nearby grinned good-humoredly. I understood, admired the skill with which she was glossing over my clownishness, and had the sense to take her hint. Pulling out my pocketbook, in which there were some prescription blanks, I tore one off and handed it to her with a muttered apology. Taking the paper from me with a smile and a good night, she departed. She had saved the situation, but I felt that, as far as my position with her was concerned, the case was hopeless, that she loathed me for my insensate folly, hated me more than death, that again and again and again, however often I might come, she would drive me from her door like a dog. I stumbled across the room, people staring at me. No doubt there was something strange about my appearance. Making my way to the buffet, I drank 4 glasses of brandy in brief succession. My nerves were worn to rags, and nothing but this overdose of stimulant would have kept me going. I slipped away by a side door, furtively, as if I had been a burglar. Not for a kingdom would I have crossed the great hall again, have exposed myself to mocking eyes. What did I do next? I can hardly remember. Wandering from one saloon to another, I tried to drink myself into oblivion, but nothing could dull my senses. Still I heard the laugh which had first driven me crazy and the feigned laughter with which she had covered up my boorishness that evening. Walking on the quays, I looked down into the water and regretted bitterly that I had not brought my pistol with me so that I could blow out my brains and drop into the quiet pool. My mind became fixed on this automatic and I resolved to make an end of myself. I warily went back to the hotel. If I refrained from shooting myself in the small hours, it was not, believe me, from cowardice. Nothing I should have liked better than to press the trigger in the conviction that thus I could put an end to the torment of my thoughts. After all, I was obsessed by the idea of duty, that accursed notion of duty. It maddened me to think that she might still have need of me, to know that she really did need me. Here was Thursday morning. In 2 days her husband would be back. I was sure this proud woman would never live to face the shame that must ensue upon discovery. I tramped up and down my room for hours, turning these thoughts over in my mind, cursing the impatience, the blunders that had made it impossible for me to help her. How was I to approach her now? How was I to convince her that all I asked was to be allowed to serve her? She would not see me. She would not see me. In fancy I heard her fierce laughter and watched her nostrils twitching with contempt. Up and down the 10 feet of my narrow room till the tropic day had dawned and speedily the morning sun was glaring into the veranda. As you know, in the tropics everyone is up and about by 6. Flinging myself into a chair, I seized some letter paper and began to write to her. Anything, everything, a cringing letter, in which I implored her forgiveness, proclaimed myself a madman and a villain, besought her to trust me, to put herself in my hands after all. I swore that I would disappear thereafter, from the town, the colony, the world, if she wanted me to. Let her only forgive me and trust me. Allow me to help her in this supreme moment. I covered 20 pages. It must have been a fantastic letter, like one penned in a lunatic asylum or by a man in the delirium of fever. When I had finished, I was dripping with sweat and the room whirled round me as I rose to my feet. Gulping down a glass of water, I tried to read through what I had written, but the words swam before my eyes. I reached for an envelope and then it occurred to me to add something that might move her. Snatching up the pen once more, I scrawled across the back of the last page, "Shall await a word of forgiveness here at the hotel. If I don't hear from you before nightfall, I shall shoot myself." Closing the letter, I shouted for one of the boys and told him to have the chit delivered instantly. There was nothing more for me to do but to await an answer. As if to mark this interval, it was some minutes before he spoke again. When he did so, the words came with a renewed impetus. Christianity has lost its meaning for me. The old myths of heaven and hell no longer influence me, but if there were a hell I should dread it little, for there could be no hell worse than those hours I spent in the hotel. A little room, baking in the noonday heat. You know these hotel rooms in the tropics. Only a bed and a table and a chair. Nothing on the table but a watch and an automatic. Sitting on the chair in front of the table, a man staring at the watch and the pistol. A man who ate nothing, drank nothing, did not even smoke, but sat without stirring as he looked at the dial of his watch and saw the second hand making its unending circuit. That was how I spent the day, waiting. And yet, for all that I was motionless, I was still like the Malay running amok or like a rabid dog pursuing my frenzied course to destruction. Well, I won't make any further attempt to describe those hours. Enough to say that I don't understand how anyone can live through such a time and keep reasonably sane. At 22 minutes past 3, my eyes were still glued to the watch. There came a knock at the door. A native youngster with a folded scrap of paper, no envelope. I snatched it from him and he was gone before I had time to tear open the note. Then, to begin with, I could not read the brief message. Here was her reply at last, and the words ran together before my eyes. They conveyed no meaning to me. I had to dip my head in cold water and calm my agitation before my senses cleared and I could grasp the meaning of the penciled English. Too late. Still, you'd better stay at the hotel. Perhaps I shall have to send for you in the end. There was no signature on the crumpled page. a blank half-sheet torn from a prospectus or something of the kind. The writing was unsteady, perhaps from agitation, perhaps because it had been written in a moving carriage. How could I tell? All I knew was that anxiety, haste, horror seemed to cling to it, that it gripped me profoundly, and yet that I was glad, for at least she had written to me. I was to keep alive, for she might need me. She might let me help her after all. I lost myself in the maddest conjectures and hopes. I read the curt words again and again. I kissed them repeatedly. I grew calmer and passed into a stage betwixt sleep and waking when time no longer had any meaning. Coma vigil is what we doctors call it. This must have lasted for hours. Dusk was at hand when I came to myself with a start, so it was certainly near 6 o'clock. Had there been another knock? I listened intently. Then it was unmistakable, a knocking, gentle yet insistent, and steady, for I felt giddy and faint. I sprang to the door. There in the passage stood the China boy. It was still light enough to show me not only the traces of my rough handling, not only black eyes and a bruised chin, but that his yellow face was ashen pale. "Master, come quickly." That was all. I ran downstairs, the boy at my heels. A gharry was waiting and we jumped in. "What has happened?" I asked, as the man drove off without further orders. The boy looked at me, his lips twitched, but he said never a word. I repeated my question, still he was silent. I felt angry enough to strike him once more, yet I was touched by his devotion to his mistress, and so I kept myself in hand. If he wouldn't speak, he wouldn't, that was all. The gharryman was flogging his ponies, driving so furiously that people had to jump out of the way to avoid being run over. The streets were thronged, for we had left the European settlement and were on our way through the Javanese and Malay town into the Chinese quarter. Here the gharry drew up in a narrow alley in front of a tumble-down house. It was a sordid place, a little shop in front, lighted by a tallow candle. The attached dwelling was an unsavory hotel, one of those opium dens, brothels, thieves' kitchens, or receivers' stores, such as are run by the worst sort of Chinese in all the big cities of the East. The boy knocked at the door. It opened for an inch or two and a tedious parley ensued. Impatiently I, too, jumped out of the gharry, put my shoulder to the door, forced it open. An elderly Chinese woman fled before me with a shriek. I dashed along a passage, the boy after me, to another door. Opening this, I found myself in a dim interior, reeking of brandy and of blood. Someone was groaning. I could make out nothing in the gloom, but I groped my way towards the sound. Another pause. When he spoke again, it was with sobs almost as much as with words. I groped my way towards the sound, and there she was, lying on a strip of dirty matting, twisted with pain, sighing and groaning. I could not see her face, so dark was the room. Stretching out my hand, I found hers, which was burning hot. She was in a high fever. I shuddered as I realized what had happened. She had come to this foul den in quest of the service I had refused, had sought out a Chinese midwife, hoping in this way to find the secrecy she no longer trusted me to observe, rather than place herself in my care. She had come to the old witch I had seen in the passage, and had herself mauled by a bungler, because I had behaved like a madman, had so grievously affronted her that she thought it better to take any risks rather than to let me give the aid which, to begin with, I had only been willing to grant on monstrous terms. I shouted for light, and that detestable beldame brought a stinking and smoky kerosene lamp. I should have liked to strangle her, but what good would that have done? She put the lamp down on the table, and now, in its yellow glare, I could see the poor, martyred body. Then, of a sudden, the fumes were lifted from my brain. No longer half crazed, I forgot my anger and even for the time forgot the evil mood that had brought us to this pass. Once more I was the doctor, the man of skill and knowledge, to whom there had come an urgent call to use them for the best advantage of a suffering fellow mortal. I forgot my wretched self, and with reawakened intelligence I was ready to do battle with the forces of destruction. I passed my hands over the nude body which so recently I had lusted for. Now it had become the body of my patient and was nothing more. I saw in it only the seat of a life at grips with death, only the form of one writhing in torment. Her blood on my hands was not horrible to me, now that I was again the expert upon whose coolness everything turned. I saw, as an expert, the greatness of her danger. One saw, indeed, that all was lost, short of a miracle. She had been so mishandled that her lifeblood was rapidly draining away. And what was there, in this filthy hovel, which I could make use of in the hope of stenching the flow? Everything I looked at, everything I touched was besoiled. Not even a clean basin and clean water. "We must have you removed to hospital instantly," I said. Thereupon, torture of mind superadded to torture of body. She writhed protestingly. "No," she whispered, "no, no. I would rather die. No one must know. No one must know. Take me home, home." I understood. Her reputation was more to her than her life. I understood and I obeyed. The boy fetched a litter. We lifted her onto it and then carried her, half dead, home through the night. Ignoring the terrified questions and exclamations of the servants, we took her to her room. Then began the struggle, the prolonged and futile struggle with death. He clutched my arm so that it was hard not to shout from surprise and pain. His face was so close that I could see the white gleam of teeth and the pale sheen of spectacle glasses in the starlight. He spoke with such intensity, with such fierce wrath, that his voice assailed me like something betwixt a hiss and a shriek. "You, a stranger I have never glimpsed in the daylight, you who are, I suppose, touring the world at your ease, do you know what it is to see someone die? Have you ever sat by anyone in the death agony, seen the body twisting in the last wrestle and the blue fingernails clawing at vacancy, heard the rattle in the throat, watched the inexpressible horror in the eyes of the dying? Have you ever had that terrible experience, you, an idler, a globetrotter, who can talk so glibly about one's duty to help? I have seen it often enough as a doctor, have studied death as a clinical happening. Once only have I experienced it in the full sense of the term. Once only have I lived with another and died with another. Once only, during that ghastly vigil a few nights ago when I sat cudgelling my brains for some way of stopping the flow of blood, some means of cooling the fever which was consuming her before my eyes, some method of staving off imminent death. Do you understand what it is to be a doctor, thoroughly trained in the science and practice of medicine, and, as you sagely remark, one whose first duty is to help, and to sit powerless by the bedside of the dying, knowing, from all one's knowledge, only one thing, that one can give no help, to feel the pulse as it flickers and fades. My hands were tied. I could not take her to the hospital, where something might have been done to give her a chance. I could not summon aid. I could only sit and watch her die, mumbling meaningless invocations like an old apple woman at church, and next minute clenching my fists in impotent wrath against a non-existent deity. Can you understand? Can you understand? What I cannot understand is how one survives such hours, why one does not die with the dying, how one can get up next morning and clean one's teeth and put on one's necktie, how one can go on living in the ordinary way after feeling what I had felt. For the first time, that one I would give anything and everything to save was slipping away, some with her, beyond recall. There was an additional torment. As I sat beside the bed, I had given her an injection of morphine to ease the pain, and she lay quiet now with cheeks ashen pale. I felt the unceasing tension of a fixed gaze boring into my back. The China boy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, murmuring prayers in his own tongue. Whenever I glanced at him, he raised his eyes imploringly to mine, like a hound dumbly beseeching aid. He lifted his hands as if in supplication to a god, lifted them to me, the impotent weakling who knew that all was vain, that I was of no more use in that room than an insect running across the floor. It added to my torture, this petitioning of his, this fanatical conviction that my skill would enable me to save the woman whose life was ebbing as he looked on and prayed. I could have screamed at him and have trampled him underfoot. So much did his eager expectancy hurt me, and yet I felt that he and I were bound together by our fondness for the dying woman and by the dread secret we shared. Like an animal at watch, He sat huddled up behind me, but the instant I wanted anything he was alert, eager to fetch it, hoping I had thought of something that might help even now. He would have given his own blood to save her life. I am sure of it. So would I. But what was the use of thinking of transfusion, even if I had had the instruments, when there were no means of arresting the flow of blood? It would only have prolonged her agony. But this China boy would have died for her, as would I. Such was the power she had, and I had not even the power to save her from bleeding to death. Towards daybreak she regained consciousness, awoke from the drugged sleep. She opened her eyes, which were no longer proud and cold. The heat of fever glowed in them as she looked round the room. Catching sight of me, she was puzzled for a moment and needed an effort to recall who this stranger was. Then she remembered. She regarded me at first with enmity, waving her arms feebly as if to repel me and showing by her movements that she would have fled from me had she but had the strength. Then, collecting her thoughts, she looked at me more calmly. Her breathing was labored. She tried to speak. She wanted to sit up, but was too weak. Begging her to desist, I leaned closer to her so that I should be able to hear her lightest whisper. She regarded me piteously. Her lips moved, and faint indeed was the whisper that came from them. No one will find out. No one, I responded with heartful conviction. No one shall ever know. Her eyes were still uneasy. With a great effort she managed to breathe the words, "Swear that no one shall know." "Swear it." I raised my hand solemnly and murmured, "I pledge you my word." She looked at me, weak though she was, cordially, gratefully. Yes, despite all the harm I had done, she was grateful to me at the last. She smiled her thanks. A little later she tried to speak again, but was not equal to the exertion. Then she lay peacefully, with her eyes closed. Before daylight shone clearly into the room, all was over. A long silence. He had overcome the frenzy which had prompted him to seize me by the arm and had sunk back exhausted. The stars were paling when 3 bells struck. A fresh though gentle breeze was blowing as herald of the dawn that comes so quickly in the tropics. Soon I could see him plainly. He had taken off his cap so that his face was exposed. It was pinched with misery. He scanned me through his spectacles with some interest to see what sort of a man was this stranger to whom he had been pouring out his heart. Then he went on with his story, speaking with a scornful intonation. For her, all was over, but not for me. I was alone with the corpse in a strange house, in a town where, as in all such places, gossip runs like wildfire, and I had pledged my word that her secret should be kept. Consider the situation. Here was a woman moving in the best society of the colony and, to all seeming, in perfect health. She had danced the evening before last at Government House. Now she was dead, and the only doctor who knew anything about the matter, the man who had sat by her while she died, was a chance visitor to the town, summoned to her bedside by one of the servants. This doctor and this servant had brought her home in a litter under cover of darkness and had kept everyone else out of the way. Not until morning did they call the other servants to tell them their mistress was dead. The news would be all over the town within an hour or two, and how was I, the doctor from an up-country station, to account for the sudden death? For what I had done and for what I had failed to do. Why hadn't I sent for one of my colleagues to share the responsibility? Why? I knew what lay before me. My only helper was the China boy, but he, at any rate, was a devoted assistant who realized that there was still a fight to be fought. I had said to him, "I understand, don't you? Your mistress's last wish was that no one shall know what has happened." "Savi planti, master," he answered simply, and I knew that I could trust him. He washed the blood stains from the floor, set all to right as quickly as possible, and his fortitude sustained mine. Never before have I had so much concentrated energy, nor shall I ever have it again. When one has lost everything but a last remnant, one fights for that last remnant with desperate courage, with fierce resolution. The remnant for which I was fighting was her legacy to me, her secret. I was calm and self-assured in my reception of everyone who came, telling them the tale I had decided upon to account for the death. After all, people are used to sudden, grave, and fatal illness in the tropics, and the laity cannot openly question a doctor's authoritative statements. I explained that the China boy, whom she had sent to fetch the doctor when she was taken ill, had chanced to meet me. But while talking thus to all and sundry with apparent composure, I was awaiting the one man who really mattered, the senior surgeon, who would have to inspect the body before burial could take place. It was Thursday morning, and on Saturday the husband was coming back. Speedy burial is the rule in this part of the world, but the senior surgeon, not I, would have to sign the necessary certificates. At 9 he was announced. I had sent for him, of course. He was my superior in rank, and he bore me a grudge because of the local reputation I had acquired in the little matter of the vice-resident's broken leg. This was the doctor of whom she had spoken so contemptuously, as good only for bridge. According to official routine, my wish for a transfer would pass through his hands. No doubt the vice-resident had already mentioned it to him. The instant we met that morning, I guessed his amity, but this only steeled me to my task. As soon as I came into the anteroom where he was waiting, he began the attack. When did Madame Blank die? At 6 this morning. When did she send for you? At nightfall yesterday. Did you know that I was her regular professional attendant? Eyes. Why didn't you send for me then? There wasn't time, and besides, Madame Blank had put herself in my hands exclusively. In fact, she expressly forbade me to call in any other doctor. He stared at me, his face flushed. Suppressing an angry retort, he said with assumed indifference, "Well, even though you could get on without me so long as she was alive, you have fulfilled your official duty in sending for me now, and I must fulfill mine by verifying the death and ascertaining the cause." I made no answer and let him lead the way to the death chamber. As soon as we were there and before he could touch the body, I said, "It is not a question of ascertaining the cause of death, but of inventing a cause." Madame Blank sent for me to save her, if I could, from the consequences of an abortion clumsily performed by a Chinese midwife. To save her life was impossible, but I pledged my word to save her reputation. "I want you to help me." He looked his surprise. "I actually want me, the senior surgeon of this province, to join you in concealing a crime." Eyes, that is what I want you to do. In fact, he said with a sneer, I am to help in the hushing up of a crime you have committed. I have given you to understand that, as far as Madame Blank is concerned, all I have done is to try to save her from the consequences of her own indiscretion and someone else's crime. If you want to insist on the word, had I been the culprit, I should not be alive at this hour. She has herself paid the extreme penalty, and the miserable bungler who procured the abortion really does not matter one way or the other. You cannot punish the criminal without tarnishing the dead woman's reputation, and that I will not suffer. I will not suffer it. You talk to me as if you were my official chief, instead of my being yours. You dare to order me about. I had already surmised there must be something queer when you were summoned from your nook in the backwoods. A fine beginning you've made of it with your attempt to interlope here. Well, all that remains for me is to make my own investigation, and I can assure you that I shall report exactly what I find. I'm not going to put my name to a false certificate. You needn't think so. I was imperturbable. I will have to, this once. If you don't, you'll never leave the room alive. I put my hand in my pocket. The pistol was not there. I had left it in my room at the hotel, but the bluff worked. He drew back in alarm, whereupon I made a step forward and said, with a calculated mingling of threat and conciliation, "Look here, I shall be sorry to go to extremes, but you'd better understand that I don't value either my life or yours at a single stiver. I'm so far through that there's only one thing in the world left for me to care about, and that's the keeping of my promise to this dead woman that the manner of her death shall remain secret. I give you my word that if you sign a certificate to the effect that she died of, what shall we say, a sudden access of malignant tropical fever with hyperpyrexia, leading to heart failure, that will sound plausible enough. If you do this, I will leave the Indies within a week. I will, if you like, put a bullet through my head as soon as she is buried, and I can be sure that no one, understand, no one, can make any further examination. That should satisfy you. In fact, it must satisfy you. My voice, my whole aspect, must have been menacing, for he was cowed. Whenever I advanced a little, he retreated, showing that uncontrollable fear with which people flee from a man brandishing a blood-stained kriss, a man who is running amok. He wilted visibly and changed his tone. He was no longer the adamantine official, standing invincibly upon punctilio. Still, with the last vestige of resistance, he murmured, "Never in my life have I signed a false certificate. Perhaps there would be no question raised if I were to word the document as you suggest. It is perfectly clear to me, however, that I ought not to do anything of the kind." "Of course you ought not, judging by conventional standards," I rejoined, wishing to help him to save his face. "But this is a special case. When you know that the disclosure of the truth can only bring grievous suffering to a living man and blast the reputation of a dead woman, why hesitate?" He nodded. We sat down together at the table. Amicable enough now to all seeming, we concocted the certificate which was the basis of the account of the matter published in next day's newspaper. Then he stood up and looked at me searchingly. "I will sail for Europe by the next boat, won't you?" "Of course. I've pledged you my word." He continued to stare at me. I saw that he wanted to be strict and businesslike and that the task was hard. It was as much in the endeavor to hide his embarrassment as from any wish to convey information that he said, Blank was going home with his wife immediately after his arrival from Yokohama. I expect the poor fellow will want to take his wife's body back to her people in England. He's a wealthy man, you know, and the rich can indulge these fancies. I shall order the coffin instantly and have it lined with sheet lead so that it can be sealed. That will get over immediate difficulties, and he will know that in this sweltering heat there was no possibility of awaiting his appearance on the scene. Even if he thinks we've been precipitate, he won't venture to say so. We're officials, and he's only a merchant after all, though he could buy us both up and never miss the money. Besides, we're acting as we do to save him needless pain. My enemy of a few minutes was now my acknowledged confederate. Well, he knew he was soon going to be rid of me forever, and he had to justify himself to himself. But what he did next was utterly unexpected. He shook me warmly by the hand. "I hope you'll soon be all right again," he said. What on earth did he mean? Was I ill? Was I mad? I opened the door for him ceremoniously and bade him farewell. Therewith my energies ran down. The room swam round me and I collapsed beside her bed as the frenzied Malay collapses when he has run his murderous course and is at last shot down. I don't know how long I lay on the floor. At length there was a rustling noise, a movement in the room. I looked up. There stood the China boy, regarding me uneasily. "Someone have come. Want ye see Mrs.?" he said. "I mustn't let anyone in. But, master," he hesitated, looked at me timidly, and tried in vain to speak. The poor wretch was obviously suffering. "Who is it?" He trembled like a dog in fear of a blow. He did not utter any name. A sense of delicacy rare in a native servant restrained him. He said simply, "Blong, that man." He did not need to be explicit. I knew instantly whom he meant. At the word I was all eagerness to see this unknown, whose very existence I had forgotten. For, strange as it may seem to you, after the first disclosure she had made to me and her rejection of my infamous proposal, I had completely put him out of my mind. Amid the hurry and anxiety and stress of what had happened since, it had actually slipped my memory that there was another man concerned in the affair, the man this woman had loved, the man to whom she had passionately given what she had refused to give me. The day before, I should have hated him, should have longed to tear him to pieces. Now I was eager to see him because I loved him. Yes, loved the man whom she had loved. With a bound I was in the anteroom. A young, very young, fair-haired officer was standing there, awkward and shy. He was pale and slender, looking little more than a boy, and yet touchingly anxious to appear manlike, calm and composed. His hand was trembling as he raised it in salute. I could have put my arms round him and hugged him. So perfectly did he fulfill my ideal of the man I should have wished to be this woman's lover, not a self-confident seducer, but a tender stripling to whom she had thought fit to give herself. He stood before me, abashed. My sudden apparition, my eager scrutiny, increased his embarrassment. His face puckered slightly, and it was plain that he was on the verge of tears. "I don't want to push in," he said at length, "but I should like so much to see Madame Blank once more." Scarcely aware of what I was doing, I put an arm round the young fellow's shoulders and guided him towards the door. He looked at me with astonishment, but with gratitude as well. At this instant, we had an indubitable sense of fellowship. We went together to the bedside. She lay there, all but the head, shoulders, and arms hidden by the white linen. Feeling that my closeness must be distasteful to him, I withdrew to a distance. Suddenly he collapsed, as I had done, sank to his knees, and, no longer ashamed to show his emotions, burst into tears. What could I say? Nothing. What could I do? I raised him to his feet and led him to the sofa. There we sat side by side, and, to soothe him, I gently stroked his soft, blonde hair. He took my hand in his and pressed it affectionately. Then he said, "Tell me the whole truth, doctor. She didn't kill herself, did she?" "No," I answered. "Then is anyone else to blame for her death?" "No," I said once more, although from within was welling up the answer. I, and you. The two of us, we are to blame, we two, and her unhappy pride. But I kept the words unuttered, and was content to say yet again, no. No one was to blame. It was her doom. I can't realize it. He groaned. It seems incredible. The night before last she was at the ball. She nodded to me and smiled. How could it happen? How did she come to die so unexpectedly, so swiftly? I told him a string of falsehoods. Even from her lover I must keep the secret. We spent that day and the next together in brotherly converse, both aware, though we did not give the knowledge voice, that our lives were intertwined by our relationship to the dead woman. Again and again I found it hard to keep my own counsel, but I did so. He never learned that she had been with child by him, that she had come to me to have the fruit of their love destroyed, and that, after my refusal, she had taken the step which had ended her own life as well. Yet we talked of nothing but her during those days when I was hidden in his quarters. I had forgotten to tell you that. They were searching for me. Her husband had arrived after the coffin had been closed. He was suspicious. All sorts of rumors were afoot, and he wanted my account of the matter at first hand. But I simply couldn't endure the thought of meeting him, the man through whom I knew she had suffered. So I hid myself, and during those for days I never left the house. Her lover took a passage for me under a false name, and late at night I went on board the boat bound for Singapore. I left everything, all my possessions, the work I had done in the last 7 years. My house stood open to anyone who chose to enter it. No doubt the authorities have already erased my name from the list of their officials as absent without leave. But I could not go on living in that house, that town, that world, where everything reminded me of her. If I fled like a thief in the night, it was to escape her, to forget her. Vain was the attempt. When I came on board at midnight, my friend with me to see me off, a great, oblong, breastbound chest was being hoisted on board by the crane. It was her coffin. Her coffin. It had followed me, just as I had followed her down from the hills to the coast. I could make no sign. I had to look on unheeding, for her husband was there too. He was on his way to England. Perhaps he means to have the coffin opened when he gets there, to have a post-mortem made, to find out. Anyhow, he has taken her back to him, has snatched her away from us. She belongs to him now, not to us. At Singapore, where I transshipped to this German mailboat, the coffin was transshipped as well, and he is here too, her husband. But I am still watching over her and shall watch over her to the end. He shall never learn her secret. I shall defend her to the last against the man to escape whom she went to her death. He shall learn nothing, nothing. Her secret belongs to me and to no one else in the world. Do you understand? Do you understand why I keep out of the other passengers' way? Why I cannot bear to hear them laugh and chatter, to watch their foolish flirtations, when I know that deep down in the hold, among the tea chests and the cases of Brazil nuts, her body lies. I can't get near it, for the hatches are closed. but I feel its nearness by day and by night when the passengers are tramping up and down the promenade deck or dancing merrily in the saloon. It is stupid of me, I know. The sea ebbs and flows above millions of corpses, and the dead are rotting beneath every spot where one sets foot on land. All the same, I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it when they dance and laugh in this ship which is taking her body home. I know what she expects of me. There is still something left for me to do. Her secret is not yet safe, and until it is safe, my pledge to her will be unfulfilled. From midships there came splashing and scraping noises. The sailors were swabbing the decks. He started at the sound and jumped to his feet. "I must be going," he murmured. He was a distressing sight, with his careworn expression and his eyes reddened by weeping and by drink. He had suddenly become distant in his manner. Obviously, he was regretting his loquacity, was ashamed of himself for having opened his heart to me as he had done. Wishing to be friendly, however, I said, "Won't you let me pay you a visit in your cabin this afternoon?" A smile, mocking, harsh, cynical, twisted his lips, and when he answered, after a momentary hesitation, it was with appropriate emphasis. "Oh, yes, it's one's duty to help. That's your favorite maxim, isn't it? Your use of it a few hours ago, when you caught me in a weak moment, has loosened my tongue finely. Thank you for your good intentions, but I'd rather be left to myself. Don't imagine, either, that I feel any better for having turned myself inside out before you and for having shown you my very entrails. My life has been torn to shreds and no one can patch it together again. I have gained nothing by working in the Dutch colonial service for 7 years. My pension has gone fut and I am returning to Germany a pauper like a dog that slinks behind a coffin. A man cannot run amok without paying for it. In the end, he is shot down, and I hope that for me the end will come soon. I'm obliged to you for proposing to call, but I've the best of companions to prevent my feeling lonely in my cabin, plenty of bottles of excellent whiskey. They're a great consolation. Then there's another old friend, and my only regret is that I didn't make use of it soon instead of late. My automatic, I mean, which will in the end be better for my soul than any amount of open confession. So I won't trouble you to call, if you don't mind. Among the rights of man there is a right which no one can take away, the right to croak when and where and how one pleases, without a helping hand. He looked at me scornfully and with a challenging air, but I knew that at bottom his feeling was one of shame, infinite shame. Saying no word of farewell, he turned on his heel and slouched off in the direction of the cabins. I never saw him again, though I visited the foredeck several times after midnight. So completely did he vanish that I might have thought myself the victim of hallucination had I not noticed among the other passengers a man wearing a crepe armlet, a Dutchman, I was told, whose wife had recently died of tropical fever. He walked apart, holding converse with no one, and was melancholy of mien. Watching him, I was distressed by the feeling that I was aware of his secret trouble. When my path crossed his, I turned my face away. Last he should divine from my expression that I knew more about his fate than he did himself. In Naples harbor occurred the accident which was explicable to me in the light of the stranger's tale. Most of the passengers were, as I have said, ashore at the time. I had been to the opera and had then sipped in one of the brightly lit cafes in the Via Rome. As I was being rowed back to the steamer, I noticed that there was a commotion going on round the gangway, boats moving to and fro and man in them holding torches and acetylene lamps as they scanned the water. On deck there were several carabinieri talking in low tones. I asked one of the deckhands what was the matter. He answered evasively, so that it was obvious he had been told to be discreet. Next morning, too, when we were steaming towards Genoa, I found it impossible to glean any information. But at Genoa, in an Italian newspaper, I read a high-flown account of what had happened that night at Naples. Under cover of darkness, it appeared, to avoid disquieting the passengers, a coffin from the Dutch Indies was being lowered into a boat. It contained the body of a lady, and her husband, who was taking it home for burial, was already waiting in the boat. Something heavy had, when the coffin was halfway down the ship's side, dropped on it from the upper deck, carrying it away, so that it fell with a crash into the boat. which instantly capsized. The coffin, being lined with lead, sank. Fortunately, there had been no loss of life, for no one had been struck by the falling coffin, and the widower, together with the other persons in the boat, had been rescued, though not without difficulty. What had caused the accident? One story, said the reporter, was that a lunatic had jumped overboard and in his fall had wrenched the coffin from its lashings. Perhaps the story of the falling body had been invented to cover up the remissness of those responsible for lowering the coffin, who had used tackle that was too weak, so that the lead-weighted box had broken away of itself. Anyhow, the officers were extremely reticent. In another part of the paper was a brief notice to the effect that the body of an unknown man, apparently about 35 years of age, had been picked up in Naples harbor. There was a bullet wound in the head. No one connected this with the accident which occurred when the coffin was being lowered. Before my own eyes, however, as I read the brief paragraphs, there loomed from the printed page the ghostly countenance of the unhappy man whose story I have here set down. Thank you for listening. For more audiobooks, please like and share.